Welcome back to our study of Hebrews. We are now in lesson 13, chapter 11, and we will be studying about a superior principle. Okay, as we often do, I do want to go back and just look at our outline again. Our general outline. Let's see, we have Jesus Christ, a superior being, chapters 1 through 6. And then we have the second part was Christianity, where we talked about a superior religion. That was chapters 7 through 10. And now we have the series on faith, these final 3 chapters. And that is entitled A Superior Principle, chapters 11 to 13. So this is the final section on faith. In previous chapters, the writer has shown Jesus to be not only a superior person, but also a superior priest with a superior priesthood under a superior covenant. So, this is meant to be a great encouragement to his readers. Now here in chapter 11, you know this is the faith chapter, he begins with a description of faith, which is faith is an essential asset for his readers. And he's wanting to get this across to them. So he's going to take them on a journey of faith, beginning with creation, then highlighting key figures along the way from the history of God's people, the people of the readers, till he reaches a climax with Jesus in chapter 12. And then he will urge his readers to live this faith story themselves. All right, let's go ahead and read this beautiful chapter. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a matter of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, who was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Okay, it's a beautiful chapter. So, if you've done your questions, Question number 1 was define faith. That's Hebrews 11, verse 1, of course. Now, faith is the confidence of what we hope for, the assurance about what we do not see. Other versions have faith is the substance of what we hope for, the evidence of things not seen. Now, this word that in my Bible is confidence. In the Greek, it does mean substance. It means to stand under, support, be a support. So faith is a support. It's like faith is to a Christian like a foundation is to a house or a building. It's the support. It's not a feeling. It's not intellectually what we would accept as doctrine. It's not we don't have blind optimism. This faith is real. It's a foundation. It's the foundation of our Christianity. Assurance or evidence means conviction. Conviction. It's more than simple belief. You know, some people have trouble, what's the difference between faith and belief? You can believe something, but do you have faith in it? Okay? Faith is the conviction that what God has promised, He will do. What God has promised, He will do. And all these people in this honor roll of faith, God promised them things. And He followed through with that. Okay. Ephesians 3 verse 20 says, He is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us. True Bible faith is confident obedience in God's Word, in spite of circumstances and consequences. Even when circumstances seem impossible and consequences are frightening and unknown, we must trust God. God will ultimately prevail. I read something I thought was humorous, but it's so true. Nero is the emperor that condemned Paul. Well, the years have passed on, and now the time has come when people call their sons Paul, and they call their dogs Nero. I thought that was cute. Anyway, this is in verse 2, it says, ancients were commended for this kind of faith. This kind of faith. Now, remember, this letter was written to Hebrew Christians, and he's talking about their people. They are descendants of these people that are in this chapter. Your question 2, what did the Hebrews accept by faith that men today are still trying to disprove? And that's in verse 3, the creation, that the universe, heaven and earth, was created by God. Faith makes it possible for the believer to accept that God created everything by His command. He spoke, and it became visible. Question number 3. The fact that it is possible for man to have a relationship with God is evidenced by the faith of what 2 Old Testament heroes? Verses 4 and 5. Answer, Abel and Enoch. Now, how did Abel get his faith? We read about this story of Abel in Genesis 4, verses 2 through 5. Well, Abel got his faith the same way we get our faith. Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. He heard the Word of God. So, there was evidently a problem between Abel and, well, not between Abel and Cain, but there was a problem with Cain's offering. Abel gave God a good offering, an acceptable offering. Cain did not. So evidently God had revealed to Abel and Cain what he expected, what true worship was. Abel followed God's instructions. As a shepherd, it said he brought the fat portions of the firstborn of his flock, the very best parts of the very first flock, the very first of the flock. He offered the best he had. Now, when it talks about Cain, he just said that Cain brought some of his food to him. So we don't really know why Abel's was acceptable and Cain's was not, but we do know that Abel is in this honor roll of faith because he obeyed God. He was commended as righteous, the Hebrew writer says. Now, so, conclusion. Abel demonstrated his faith by his offering of worship. Now, what do we know about Enoch? Well, Genesis 5 verse 24 says, Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. So it says he walked with God. He walked faithfully with God. So he has faith walking. Hebrews 11 verse 5 says that he was one who pleased God. And Enoch demonstrated this faith, his faith, by pleasing God. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 9 says, so we make it our goal to please God. Any decision we make, we must make it thinking, what pleases God? Is this decision I'm making pleasing to God? So, conclusion, faith provides approval from God for man. It's because he says Abel was commended as righteous. Enoch was commended as one who pleased God. So, 2 Timothy 2 verse 15 says, present yourself to God as one approved. So, your question number 4, what must one have in order to please God? Verse 6, and that of course is faith. And I'm not keeping up with this. I'm very sorry. So now you have it right here. Now Hebrews 11:6, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So what does question number 5, what does the last half of verse 6 imply as to man's relationship with God? Well, remember, in the garden, man was separated from God because of sin. So now we have a way to come to God. So we must believe in him. The belief in his existence is absolutely essential. But faith is more than just believing he exists. He also wants us to trust him, to believe in his promises, to believe that there is a way to have a relationship with God right now. And when that way is found, that one is willing to follow that way, to go that way, and seek God wholeheartedly. That's John 14:6. Jesus is the way. God yearns for the confidence and love of his children, just like an earthly father yearns for that. Don't you just love to get out of the car whenever you get home and you see your children or your grandchildren running towards you because they're so excited to see you? It just fills my heart with joy. And it fills God's heart with joy when we yearn for him, when we are excited to be in his presence. He's pleased when his children come to him with their needs. When he has satisfied our needs, we come to him with thanksgiving. He wants to hear about our sorrows and our joys. He can see it, but he wants us to talk to him, to express to him our feelings. So faith is the basis, the foundation on which our relationship with God is built. And our reward? Well, the world says, I need to see first, then I'll believe. St. Augustine wrote this: faith is to believe what we do not see. The reward of faith is to see what we believe. Let me read that again. Faith is to believe what we do not see. The reward of faith is to see what we believe. I'm looking forward to seeing heaven. I believe in heaven. I believe in Jesus and God. Question number 6. Use one word to describe how each of the list of faithful heroes of the Old Testament demonstrated their faith in God. Hebrews 11, 7 through 38. Okay. There are so many things that you could write here, and you'll notice that I left your page blank. I just put names there. There are lots of adjectives that you could use for all of these, so you don't have to use mine. But we will go over what I have chosen. All right, I've already told you 2 of them. First one is Abel, faith offering. The second is Enoch, faith walking. All right, and what about Noah? Verse 7. Now, when God warned Noah about things not yet seen, in holy fear, he built an ark to save his family. So, faith fearing. Now, remember us talking about when God says hear, like hear, O Israel, it's not just with your ears. It's with your whole being. He wants you to understand it. He wants you to put it into practice. Well, that's what Noah did. He was warned by God. Now, he'd probably never seen a flood because he'd probably never seen rain. But he believed God that this was going to happen. And fear also means reverence. He built it with great care, making sure that he built it just the way God wanted him to build it. He spent 120 years of his life building this ark. Now, part of that time he was planning it. Part of that time he was getting his tools together, getting all his materials together. About 120 years, that's a long time. And throughout this period, his faith influenced his family. Now, can we demand that our children have the same faith in God that we have? We cannot. I mean, we can, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. They can't just inherit our faith, just like they inherit our genes. But we can guide them, can't we? We can guide them by our example to make them want to be part of God's family, to develop a faith of their very own. Continuing on, it said, his faith condemned the world. 1 John 3 verse 12 said, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. So many times righteous people who have not done anything wrong, they're not criminals, but they are persecuted by evil people just because they're righteous. So, by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Now, a lot of times we hear that Moses preached to the people. Well, if you look in Genesis, it never says that he did that, ever. However, in 2 Peter 2 verse 5, we read that Peter mentions Noah as a preacher of righteousness who was protected by God when the world experienced his judgment. All right, so he did preach. Whether he may have been preaching by example or by words, but they saw what he was doing. How can you miss that? Can you miss saying that? He did it. He was doing it for 120 years. So it's likely that people would come to view what he was doing. Noah was the first person in the Bible to be called righteous. That was Genesis 6 verse 9. Now, the Hebrew writer, remember, said that Abel was commended as righteous. But that's what the Hebrew writer says. Genesis does not mention that. So Noah was the first person in the Bible to be called righteous. Now, heir. He became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. What is an heir? An heir is one who receives his allotted possession by right of sonship. Now, what is righteousness? It's being acceptable to God. So he became heir of this righteousness because he was acceptable to God because of his faith. Continuing on with Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So Abraham was faith obeying. Now he lived in Haran, Genesis 11:31, and God told him to begin this journey. He didn't know where he was going. But God made him a promise that he was leading him to a place that he would inherit, a land that would be his. And Abraham was willing to live in tents, to be a stranger in a foreign country. Now, that's important when it says this. Verse 9, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. God gave this land to him, but he lived in it like a stranger. Now, back then, when you were living in a foreign country, this word in the Greek is paroikos. You were a resident alien. We have resident aliens now. My son is a resident alien. He lives in England. He is not English. He is American, but he lives there. He has established residence there. But this is the same word used in the Bible for when the Jews were captives in Babylon. They were always looked on as outsiders. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all looked on as outsiders, even though God had given them this land. Why could they do that? It's because they believed in the promises of God. Faith makes it possible to leave the comfort zone, doesn't it? When you go, well, I went to the mission field with my family, and we left our comfort zone by faith. Missionaries leave their comfort zone to live in a foreign country, to live in a different culture, a culture not their own. So, Abraham's example to his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob was phenomenal. They walked in his footsteps, and because they did this, they gained the same inheritance as Abraham. None of them, however, owned any property. Now, Abraham did purchase a cave near Hebron at one time for burial. When Sarah died, he purchased this property. Buried there today are Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. And then when they took Joseph's bones back, I believe that's where they put those. But all three of these patriarchs knew that God's promise was not physical, but spiritual. They had to have known that. The unseen city, verse 10, they were looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All right, 11, Sarah. By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. So, Sarah accepted what he said was true. When Abraham was first told that he would bear a son, he was 86. He was 75. And Sarah was 66. They were already beyond the age of childbearing, even for that time. Now, the next time, when Ishmael was born, Abraham was 86, and Sarah was 77. That was Genesis 16, verse 16. Now, remember when the visitors came, when the angels came to Abraham's tent, and they restated this promise? At that time, Abraham was 99, and of course Sarah was 90. That's when she laughed. But when Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 91. Faith made it possible for them to accept and accomplish what was humanly impossible. Okay, going on to verse 12. At Abraham's rewards. Although it says in verse 12 he was as good as dead, as far as procreation, he had descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. From Abraham came the Ishmaelites, the Israelites, Keturah's descendants. After Sarah died, Abraham married again and had more sons. His descendants from Keturah were the Midianites. And then he was also the father of the Edomites, who are now the Arabs, because Jacob and Esau were twins. 3 monotheistic religions came from Abraham: Judaism, Christianity, and the Islamic faith. Now, that's why his descendants are as numerous as the stars in the sky. Right now, it's impossible to count everyone who is from Abraham. So, also, his name occurs, Abraham's name, more than 300 times in 27 books of the Bible. But in Abraham's life, he never saw any of these things come to pass. He just believed. And had this faith. Verses 13 through 16. What about the rewards of the patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons? They all still lived in tents. They didn't have any roots. or security, things that we think are necessary for survival. Now it says that they could have returned home. Remember, let's see, if they had, verse 15, if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. They could have returned, but they didn't. They stayed in the promised land. They never saw their seed multiply into great numbers. They lived by faith, verse 13. And they lived, going down just a little further in 13, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit, about being strangers. But this word foreigners is xenos in the Greek. And it means foreigners were always regarded with suspicion. And then he says strangers on earth. This word is parapedemos. It's someone staying temporarily who has, in one place, who has a home somewhere else. And there was an unwelcoming stigma about that with the people of that time because they didn't belong. They didn't belong. They weren't part of that, of those people that lived there. So, it says in verse 16, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Being called foreigners and strangers on earth, or with them having the stigma of being foreigners and strangers in a land that was not theirs, it gave them, it could have made them ashamed because of the stigma. But God is not ashamed to be called their God. Others might look down on them for their status, but not God. He had prepared a city for them. Now, verses 17 through 19. God gave Abraham an illogical choice when he told him to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. It was illogical. Why? Because of the promise God had already made with him. Verse 18. God had told them, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So, he had heard and believed this promise, and he didn't know how or when or why this was supposed to be done, but he reasoned evidently that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. So he was going to go ahead and do that. He displayed faith. When, remember whenever he told his servant in Genesis 22 verse 5, we will worship and then we will come back to you? He was stating his faith, that he had faith in God, that they would both come back, even though he was going to sacrifice Isaac. It's when we're faced with the hardest battles in life that we must accept what we cannot understand. Let me read that again. It is when we are faced with the hardest battles in life that we must accept what we cannot understand. I know that many of you have undergone terrible hardship, and you don't understand why this happened, and you probably never will. But your faith is strong like Abraham. Your faith is strong. Faith makes it possible for one to endure such an illogical test when bad things happen to good people. The devil wants you to lose your faith when bad things happen to you. But we must keep our faith and know that God is with us. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Isaac is faith blessing. He understood the promise even as a teenager. He even volunteered to be sacrificed. He allowed himself to be bound and laid on the altar. And you say, well, it's not in Genesis. No, but it is in Genesis that he carried the wood for the sacrifice. There is no way that he could have carried the wood and not be a big strong boy or a big strong man. So he could have overpowered his father. His father was old, but he allowed Abraham to bind him. So he volunteered for this. As a father, he showed his faith in the promise God had given his own father, Abraham, when he blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. His faith made it possible for him to look to the future and bless his sons. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. He was, his is faith worshiping. Now, he was very old. He had had bitter experiences in life. And he gave these blessings to his sons. He blessed the younger because it was God's will that it be so, even as it was in his own case. Now, Jacob was blessing the younger son of Joseph. Remember? You remember Manasseh and Ephraim? He crossed his hands and blessed the younger son over the older son of Joseph. And he worshiped God until the end of his life. Verse 22, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. So, I have Joseph as faith prophesying. It was 400 years later that Moses remembered this prophecy of Joseph's request. Exodus 13:19, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones with you from this place. At the time, Joseph he knew his family was there, but he did not, his family were not slaves at that time. That was a prophecy of his. All three examples of these patriarchs, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, spoke of a time when death was, very near for them. But yet they all three died without the promise. Isaac was a nomad. Jacob was an exile from the promised land. Joseph was a great man, but he still was a stranger in a strange land. But they did not despair. They had hope. Their faith defeated death. We may not live to see all of God's promises fulfilled, but we are still a link in the fulfillment. Okay? They did not live to see the promise, but they were a link in that fulfillment, as it is today. By faith, Moses' parents, let's move on to Moses' parents. Their names were Amram, and Jochebed. You'll find them in Exodus 6, verse 20. It says the Bible says they hid him for 3 months after he was born. They saw him as no ordinary child. They were not afraid of the king's edict. They must have created such an atmosphere of faith in their home, because all three of their children, Aaron, Miriam, and Moses, became great servants of God. Great servants of God. Were they perfect? No. Not even Moses was perfect. But they were great servants nonetheless. Faith makes it possible for the believer to be courageous. Continuing on with Moses. Parents were unafraid. And Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So, faith choosing. He chose wisely in all of his situations in life. He refused his rights of adoption into Pharaoh's family. He had a right. He had rights there because he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. So faith causes the believer to hold on to the right values. He chose the people of God over fame and fortune. He could have been famous and had great wealth. But faith causes the believer to make the right decisions. In verse 26, he regarded disgrace for Christ above treasures. Faith turns one from seeking approval from the world to seeking only approval, the approval of God. So, and that's what faith does. It causes us to be approved by God. Verse 27, he left Egypt. It says, not fearing the king's anger. Now, in Exodus, it said he fled the king's anger. Well, yes, he did flee. But this word, not fearing, in the Greek, it means unconcerned. He was unconcerned. He just left. So, like Enoch, he sought to please God from what he chose. He chose the right thing. By nature, though, he was hesitant. Those 40 years in the desert caused him to be hesitant, and his faith rewarded him with courage. He stood up against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He trusted God to deal with this enemy. He followed God's instructions to the letter, and because of it, the Israelites were successfully led out of bondage. I'm so sorry, excuse me. I think I'm good. All right, verse 27. It said he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Remember in Exodus 33 when God allowed him to see his back? That was a reward. One of Moses' rewards. Continuing on, let's talk about the Israelites. It talks about the Israelites passing through the Red Sea as on dry ground. The Egyptians tried it and they were all drowned. Verse 30, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army of Israel had marched around them for 7 days. Now, I'm going to say Israelites are faith trusting. And you think, wait a minute. They had to wander in the wilderness because they did not trust God. Yes, that is true. But this is an honor roll of the faithful, not the unfaithful. And when they crossed the Red Sea, they were trusting God. And then after the 40 years of wanderings, when they marched around Jericho and took Jericho, that was trusting God as well. So that's the reason why they're in this honor roll of faith. What about Rahab, the prostitute? Because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. So Rahab, faith welcoming. She had heard about Israel's God. And she knew that he was all-powerful. She chose to welcome God's people, and she was blessed. Verse 32, and what more shall I say? And he starts talking about different people. Each of the following phrases that he's talking about is meant to remind his readers, to sort of ring a bell with them in the minds of those who knew their history. Remember, the Jews knew their history really well. They memorized the Torah. They knew all the stories. All he had to do was say someone's name and visions would pop in their head. He would say a phrase about what one of them did, and they knew exactly who it was. So, we've got, I'm just going to read this. Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. I'm going to stop there and we'll pick up with verse 36 in just a minute. So let's talk about Gideon. Gideon is found in Judges 6 and 7, and I have given Gideon faith conquering. His willingness to do battle God's way won him the victory. Now what about Barak? Barak, I've listed him as faith leading. He was victorious over incredible odds, along with Deborah. Samson, faith returning. Remember, it says he turned his weakness into strength. This was Judges 13 and 16. By the way, Barak was Judges 4 and 5. All right. What about Jephthah? Faith acting, Judges 11 and 12. He was victorious in battle when he was called. David, faith submitting. He conquered kingdoms. He administered justice. Then Samuel also administered justice. Faith ministering. Daniel, I'm sure you heard that phrase in there. Faith unyielding. When it says, who shut the mouths of lions. He was unyielding. And then when it says, quench the fire of the fury flames, who do you think of? The Hebrew used Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Faith quenching the fury of the flames. Then Elijah escaped the edge of the sword. Faith winning. We also see when it says women received back their dead, women, faith serving. The son of the widow of Zarephath was brought back to life by Elijah because she ministered to Elijah during a famine. That's 1 Kings 17 verse 21. And then Elisha raised the son of the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings verse 4 because of her service for him. And then it talks about others that were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain even a better resurrection. Verse 36. Some faced jeers and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. So, in verse 35, we see this transition from greatness to suffering for their faith. So, others were rewarded, faith rewarded. So not all men and women of faith experienced miraculous deliverance, did they? In 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 and 23, 22, Zechariah was stoned by his own people. Jewish legend has it that Isaiah was sawed in two. And the Jewish people of the first century knew very well the history of the Jews between the Old Testament and New Testament. There was a period in there. It's not that there wasn't history. Things were happening with the Jews then. You probably heard of the Maccabees. It was during the days of the Maccabees. This was a terrible, terrible time in the history of the Jews, where if not for the courage and faith of men and women then, their entire religion could have been wiped out, because their entire people, the entire Jewish people, could have been completely wiped out. If they had not trusted God and been obedient to God's word, the entire nation of Israel would have perished, and the Messiah would not have been born. But they trusted God. They are the ones who went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute and persecuted and mistreated. There are books called the Maccabees that talk about this time and the persecution and the torture that they went through is just something that most people probably could not read without getting ill. Without being sick. It's just horrible what happened to people then, and how men treated men in those days. The writer here is striving to inspire his readers. He wants to instill in them a sense of responsibility to their ancestors by remembering what they suffered, what they went through, in order for his readers, these people, to have the promise. It was important to trust God, to have that faith, so that the ones who come after them would still have the promise of God. So he gives these illustrations. He doesn't name all the names, but this gives the readers an opportunity to remember their ancestors, remember their sufferings that demonstrated that the world truly was not worthy of them. And he would have us all remember and be grateful for their faith and their sacrifice, these amazing and faithful Jews. Most of them were killed because they were righteous. Remember what we read earlier, 1 John 3, verse 12? Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Satan was way back during creation when Cain and Abel when Cain killed Abel. And he's with us today as well. In military terms, the people in this honor roll of faith were the advanced guard. They are the ones that went before us to make sure that we would have the promise. They had their eyes on God, on the future world. And while the world around them lived in the present world, not believing that there could be anything more than this. Verse 39, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. All were commended for their faith. They didn't receive the promise. It only came true with the coming of the Messiah. only together with us would they be made perfect. So in our next lesson, we're going to talk about the fellowship of those who follow Jesus. But let us never forget, let us always remember this great crowd who went before us, who suffered so much, looking forward to the reality of heaven and looking forward to what we enjoy today as the reality of Christianity, being in the family of God. Let us constantly strive through our lives to be worthy of the sacrifices that they made. So, I will see you soon in Lesson 14, Chapter 12. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.